Let's get started. So welcome to this webinar on social homes and housing first. Today we'll be hearing from our two speakers, Claire Guest, who's the housing first letting leads at Liverpool City Region, and also from Ben Rickey, who speaks on behalf of, and I'm probably not pronouncing this very well, but it's chez-soi d'abord Paris. He'll introduce this again later and pronounce it much better. I'll start with giving you a bit of, as I said, background information. So today we'll be talking about how to go from sublets to mainstream housing allocations, and also talk about how different social housing approaches can support housing first programs, and then also ensure long-term stability for the clients. Because as maybe many of you know, that's always one of the biggest questions when it comes to making housing first work: where to get the housing from, where to source the housing. And this webinar is organized by the Housing First Europe Hub, and more specifically by the community of practice, a regular community of practice that the Housing First Europe Hub is organizing on housing for housing first. And during this community of practice, we bring together different practitioners and workers in housing first to talk about best practices and talk about how to help advancing housing first in Europe and how to find good ways to actually source the housing. So first of all, I'm going to pass on the word to Samara Jones, the coordinator of the Housing First Europe Hub, who's going to give some more insights about what the Housing First Europe Hub is and what it is actually about and what it is doing.
Thank you, Laura. Don't worry, I won't take very much time. I want to focus on the two examples that we have today. But just to say that for those of you who are maybe new to our webinars or to our network, the Housing First Europe Hub is a network that started up already almost 9 years ago now. It's hard to believe, or maybe 8. It depends on how we want to count. But we bring together a range of actors: cities, organizations, housing providers, government ministries, and researchers and foundations who all want to work together to make sure that housing first is the place we start when we want to address homelessness across Europe and beyond. Oops, sorry. And to do that, we bring everyone together as best we can in online forums like this, also in real live in-person events, including our Train the Trainer program, including conferences and other learning events and sharing events. And like Laura said, we really focus on how can we best exchange and share experiences that help us to learn and grow and help you to connect to colleagues in different parts of Europe and different parts of the world in order to really make these big steps that we need to take to have an impact with housing first. And as Laura said, housing is a huge piece of that. And as anybody working just about anywhere these days knows, that the housing crisis, the housing shortage, is making it even more difficult. So we have to be even more creative and work even harder to share our good and innovative practices and think about how we can use elements of those in different parts in our own contexts. I just wanted to say, again, that this year we're focusing on a couple of different things, or a few new things for us in the Housing First Europe Hub. One is that we're working hard to bring together cities. So this is also a really good opportunity to have a focus on cities and housing. And we now have regular meetings, informal meetings of cities coming together to talk about these challenges in particular that cities face when they're trying to take those next steps and really have housing first as that established response to homelessness in their systems. I wanted to highlight just two things quickly as well before I pass it on to Ben. There's a conference going on in Dublin in June. It's the International Festival of Social Housing. And we, as a Housing First Europe Hub, we have 2 sessions at that conference. And so if you happen to be looking to attend that conference or going to be there anyways, we're doing a session on housing and housing first for young people, and looking in particular at the example from Focus Ireland, how they've worked with different housing partners, how they're working within a national strategy on youth housing to really adapt and make sure that the model of Housing First for Youth works for the young people, but also for the workers and housing providers and policymakers. And we'll also have a session looking at kind of new partnerships around unlocking more housing for Housing First, with a spotlight on some really exciting work that Crisis in the UK is doing, as well as a really fascinating partnership between Housing First Netherlands and one of their social housing partners, Portaal, and we'll be spotlighting that as well in a different session. And then just to say, we have lots of resources on our website, and we'll be putting this webinar up on the website, and not to hesitate to visit, but also to get in touch if you have any other questions. And I think that's all for me. So I think, do I pass it back to Laura? I pass it back to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samara. I actually noticed I completely forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Laura Fritz. I work together with Samara and also with our other colleague, Miranda, at the Housing First Europe Hub. So we are a small team of 3 people. And we are actually going to get started now. We are going to start actually with Claire. So Claire's going to share her presentation. After that, we are going to have time for a few clarifying questions if right away there's things that you're like some burning questions that you have on your mind. You're very welcome to use the chat, but also the Q&A section of Zooms. And then afterwards, we go to Ben's presentation, and then there will be some time at the end for all the questions that you might be having later on. So I'm going to give the word to Claire now. So please, Claire, thank you very much for coming. And yeah, please share your presentation with us.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Just give me 2 seconds. I'm not really that used to Zoom. We use a lot of Teams in the UK, so it might just take me 1 quick second, but I have found the button to share. Okay. Can you all see that okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. From the beginning. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Claire Guest, and I cover lettings and tenancy sustainment for the Housing First programme in the Liverpool City region. Prior to joining Housing First, I'd worked in social housing for around 14, 15 years in a variety of roles, sort of allocations officer, housing officer, tenancy enforcement, managing a neighbourhood team, and also managing vacant properties. So I guess quite a well-rounded background that I was then able to bring over to Housing First. Just in terms of what I'm going to cover off in my session today, just a brief overview of the Housing First programme in the Liverpool City region. Just got some very brief statistics to share with you. Have a little conversation around how we source accommodation for our programme, the housing partnership that we have, which underpins the programme. An allocations policy review of the choice-based letting system called Property Pool Plus, and the impact of the changes to that system on our programme. And then just some things to consider if you would like to drive some system change within allocation processes yourselves. Okay. So first of all, just to cover off our programme, and just base letting. So just a bit of a snapshot of our service at the moment, and these statistics are up to date as of yesterday. So we launched our programme in 2019, and we're one of 3 larger pilot programmes within the UK alongside Greater Manchester and Birmingham. The Liverpool City region covers 6 local authority boroughs or areas. So we cover Liverpool, Sefton, Halton, Knowsley, St Helens and Wirral. Obviously not expecting anyone to remember this, that's why it's all here. So we're now coming into our 6th year of the programme, and since we've launched, we've housed 252 service users through various accommodation routes. We are a very large team, so our team is comprised of 3 service leads, 6 locality managers, 28 support practitioners working across those 6 boroughs, and then we have 2 programme coordinators who are very much the glue of the service. They keep all the trains running on time. And we also have access to a clinical psychology service, which we commission through Aintree Hospitals Trust. Since that programme started, we've supported 421 service users. We currently have 212 service users who are receiving support or dormanted. Of those, we have 117 who are currently in a tenancy and 58 who are seeking accommodation at the moment. In terms of choice-based lettings in Liverpool City region and how it works, we have two systems that are used by housing associations to advertise the vacant properties. So we have Property Pool Plus, and we also have Under One Roof. And the one that about today is Property Pool Plus. So basically, housing applicants are placed in a band based on their level of housing need, and then they bid against properties which meet their criteria. Now, when our programme started in 2019, these housing allocation systems would have prevented a lot of our service users from being able to register or receive an offer through this route. They were quite exclusionary. You needed identification paperwork to register. You needed to provide previous tenancy history. Criminal convictions were often a factor in excluding people from being able to register or receive accommodation. There was a requirement for references, and also the system had switched to online. And obviously, if you are homeless or particularly rough sleeping, that can be a real challenge. When we started, the LCRCA had commissioned a review of Property Pool Plus to bring it up to date with housing legislation, make it more accessible, etc. But that wouldn't have been ready by the time we launched Housing First. So what we needed to do was introduce our own allocations process with housing associations outside of Property Pool Plus, so it was a workaround. But long term, our plan was always to feed in to this allocations review of Property Pool Plus and then adopt that more widely once the review was finished. So because we were really pushing for system change, what we had to do to get us going was sort of flex the system a little bit to meet our needs and then feed in to the policy changes that were going on so that we could advocate for better system change longer term. That was always the plan. In terms of what the housing partnership and the allocation process looked like and how it functions, I'll just cover that off here. So in designing our allocation process, we asked ourselves, what are the biggest barriers to homeless people when trying to find a home? And actually, when we started unpicking that, property supply isn't the primary barrier. Actually, one of the main barriers was procedures. So what we needed to do was develop an allocation process that removed as many of those barriers as possible. And the first thing that we did was consult with our lived experience group, and we ensured that their views were captured in our allocation process and then also fed in to that review of Property Pool Plus. They were very involved in that. They commissioned their own report and fed that in. And some of the things that they shared were, some of it can be very basic, but also very impactful. So office interviews with people who they'd never met before, being asked to give a lot of personal information, that's very overwhelming. Obtaining all the ID paperwork was hard. Tenancy references, paying rent up front, or previous tenancy history, so previous evictions with housing associations who were in that letting scheme. There was a lot of nervousness around that, or that they wouldn't qualify, they wouldn't be housed. What we then did was establish a housing association working group to agree the flexibilities within the allocation process that we would like to put in. And on the back of that working group, we were able to develop some workarounds. So an ID verification letter, which we could use if a service user had no paperwork. We, as the combined authority, the Housing First programme, we would produce a letter to say, we are satisfied they are who they say they are, known to services. Here's a little bit around the history. Please proceed with the allocation, and we will obtain paperwork and send that across as and when we're able to obtain it. We were also able to negotiate no requirement for upfront rent payments or credit checks, multiple offers to secure choice, and also for previous tenancy histories or criminal convictions, not to prevent a barrier. So very much for every case to be treated and assessed on its own merits, case by case basis. And all of these things that we put into our allocation process, we pushed for those to be fed into the review of Property Pool Plus. Hang on, try and move this on. It's having a bit of a moment here. Oh, hang on, it's gone too far. In terms of achieving advocacy and buy-in, so when our programme launched, we did have a manifesto commitment to Housing First from the Liverpool City Region Metro Mayor, and that really opened a lot of doors for us. It helped us get into the right rooms with the right people, the decision makers in social housing, and helped to secure their buy-in, and also from local authorities. We fed in to the Housing Association Chief Executives Group, and we provided them with regular updates, shared the challenges that we were facing, and just ensured their continued buy-in. We had a Housing First steering group, which included representation from local authorities, homeless stakeholders, voluntary and third sectors, and we regularly fed into that in terms of how the programme was going, how the allocation process was working, and the review of Property Pool Plus that we were feeding into. We also advocated for flexibilities for homeless cases in allocation processes through any forums that we had access to. So although we were delivering a Housing First programme, one of the things that, you know, I've always tried to push for is that homelessness doesn't just affect people who are on a Housing First service. So the flexibilities that we were trying to push for within Housing First, actually, wouldn't that be wonderful if we had a much broader view of homelessness and we were putting those flexibilities in for all homelessness cases to make housing them a lot easier and more streamlined. We developed a Housing First delivery guide to share what our processes were across the housing partnership. There's just a little screenshot of what that looked like there. That was aimed for frontline staff, and I used to go out and consult with their frontline teams, listen to the frequently asked questions, and then we captured all of that in our delivery guides, and then we regularly updated it and sent it out so everybody knew what our partnership agreement was, how it should function, and the processes that we'd agreed to work towards. And to underpin that, we had a continual training offer for housing partners, so a lot of face-to-face briefings. It's always best face-to-face if possible when you're working at a local level, I think, because that really helped to maintain momentum also. In terms of the allocations policy review of Property Pool Plus, so you've just got to remember these two things were sort of running in tandem. We had our own allocations process and then the allocations review of Property Pool Plus sort of running at the same time. So changes to Property Pool Plus were finally implemented in November 2023. We were able to secure was that Housing First applicants are now exempt from qualification criteria. So that means they can register for the scheme and bid for properties. The main criteria is that they must have the capacity to hold a tenancy. Service users are granted Band A status for the locality in which they will be receiving support. That's actually quite significant in the past, and currently for some homelessness cases they don't always get urgent priority status within the social housing register, so the fact that Housing First did was quite a marked shift in how those cases were viewed and assessed, and also for it being for the locality in which they're going to be receiving support, that allows a lot of flexibility because some of them may be residing in a different locality borough, but they've been assessed as meeting, for example, they're going to be working with the Sefton team, but they're currently living in Liverpool. What it means is they'll be able to bid for properties in Sefton, so there's flexibility there. The ID verification letter that we developed in the absence of any other paperwork, that's been adopted now as part of that process, and we are pushing, hopefully, for that to be adopted a bit more broadly. So it does speed up the process as well. And also, in the event of any service users being skipped for properties, so when they bid, if they're not successful, there's also a very clear appeals process through Property Pool Plus, which we didn't really have access to before. So I feel like that's something that's really positive as well. And in the event that service users have wanted to appeal the decision, I feel like that's quite empowering for them as well, because they can see the route that is taken and it's a very clear process. Just try and move it on. Okay, in terms of what that means for us as a programme, so previously, when we first started, we were receiving direct lets from landlords. We weren't using the Property Pool Plus system. We've now seen a major shift in how we source properties for the programme, and I'd say the majority of our allocations do come through Property Pool Plus. It's the primary route in the localities that it covers. The majority of our service users who previously would have been excluded from applying for the scheme have now been able to register and start bidding. I feel like it's fairly mismatched. Some service users need more support with it than others, and then we've got others at the complete end of the spectrum who've really embraced the use of Property Pool Plus. They've taken ownership of the application and they're responsible for their own bids each week. They search for properties, they put the bids on, and then they ring the practitioners and tell them what they've done. In some localities, it speds up the rate at which properties are sourced. So Wirral is a really good example of that, I think. Just to cover off some of the challenges, so I don't want to make out that everything is perfect in us migrating across to Property Pool Plus. As with any new process, there's always challenges around implementing it. Unfortunately, under Property Pool, service users only receive one reasonable offer of accommodation. So what that means is the bidding needs to be really carefully managed, because otherwise they could lose that urgent banding status. And this has meant some adjustments. So as bear in mind, I talked at the beginning, we're now in our 6th year of the programme. We've got a couple of service users who have had a couple of tenancies throughout the programme. So those who've been used to our original allocation process receive more choice from landlords because they receive more than one offer. And that is something we tried to advocate for through the Property Pool Plus review, but we weren't able to secure it. So it is a bit of a different way of working for some of our service users and also for our own team. So we've had a lot of conversations around, are we, choice and control? Are we still able to offer choice? And we've really had to think about, what that means and what the differences are in us adopting Property Pool Plus. But one of the things that I always say is that it is the service user's choice whether or not they want to register with Property Pool. We do have a separate process in the background just to allow some flex. It won't be the route for everyone, and we're led by the service user. So in that sense, choice is still a function. Although service users can register and bid through Property Pool, individual landlords' allocation processes do still apply at point of offer. So we have had some refusals or a bit of a requirement for targeted conversations just to remind landlords of what they've agreed to in relation to Housing First and how we work and how the programme functions. I'd say 9 times out of 10, we've been able to negotiate the housing offer. There has been 1 or 2 where we haven't been successful, so we just need to be honest about that. Unfortunately, homelessness applicants across the LCR, as I mentioned earlier, they don't always receive the same banding status as Housing First cases. So we have had a bit of a mismatch with other cases outside of our programme who were in temporary accommodation receiving a lesser banding than what Housing First cases do. And that's something where we're hoping to be able to level the playing field with that a little bit. It's something Property Pool are looking at the moment. So clearly continued advocacy is required around that to make the system better for everyone. Oh, hang on, it's gone to sleep. Okay. And just finally, just I guess some things that you might like to consider or things to think about if you're looking to implement your own allocation process or try and engage with housing partners and make a bit more of a successful partnership. So some of the questions that you might want to ask is, if you have access to choice-based lettings, particularly in the UK, I suspect many will, but when was the choice-based letting scheme for your area last reviewed? So Property Pool hadn't been reviewed, I think, for about 10 or 12 years. So it was well time for an allocations policy review. If that's the case in your area, it might be time to lobby or request an allocations policy review. In terms of engagement with housing partners, what we found most successful is to seek buy-in at that senior level. So, get the commitment at that top level, but really engage through the front line. Because those who deliver the services are your best advocates. They know what works, they know their neighbourhoods, they know the processes so much better, and they know what can't be changed and where the flexibilities can apply. I would also say consider establish a working group with housing partners. Our working group has now been running for 6 years. The focus of it has shifted. At the beginning, it was very much procedural, it was allocation based. What would we like to do? What are we trying to achieve? How can we strip those barriers away? Now it's more operational in focus around the tenancies that are ongoing or ones that might be at risk or where we're experiencing challenges, but it's a really useful forum. I also think don't underestimate the level of training or briefings that are going to be required with housing partners across the partnership. It can be exhausting at times, but you do need to keep that continual training offer there and try and keep the momentum up and engage with your housing partners through available forums and be visible. I also think it's really helpful if you can develop any documentation to support your processes. What people will retain from face-to-face meetings, can be limited. It's a lot of information. So if they've got something to refer back to, and also just to remind partners of what the commitment, what the partnership is, what you're trying to achieve and how you've agreed to work together, that's incredibly helpful. If you're not in a position to do anything on a large scale, obviously everybody's programs, resources, etc. vary. What I would say is start small. So maybe if you can trial the process with one landlord and then use that to advocate for, look, we've achieved this now. This is what we've been able to do. Wouldn't it be great if you can out more widely? I think sometimes people get very hung up on, we've always worked in a certain way, we've always had that process. It really is amazing what you can achieve if you can just flex one or two smaller procedures and then use that as a bit of a stepping stone and build on it. I also think as well, do support your team around any housing partnership. Navigating the housing partnership is really, really tricky. So my role, I'm very much a conduit, I guess, between our wider housing partnership and our Housing First delivery team, and trying to help them navigate what can and can't be done, when to challenge, when to advocate, when to push quite strongly, when to leave off, all those sorts of things. It can be really challenging. And I do think the training offer that you're also delivering or making available to housing partners, you should also offer that within your own team as well. Because, there can be a lot of staff churn, or everybody has different skill sets or experiences, and there's lots of competing priorities. So I think keep that going and try to manage the expectations of your team as well as housing partners as well. It can be tricky, but it can be done. And I think that's it from me. Yeah, that is literally it from me. I'll stop sharing it now.
Thank you very much, Claire. It was, super interesting to listen to it, and thank you for sharing this best practice example. I think especially the last slide that you had when you talked about recommendations and advice, like that's, I think, very interesting, probably also for all the participants to move forward and really consider all the things that you said, also about how important it is to engage with the housing partners and have these like regular meetings, trainings, briefings, and document everything. So we have some time now for some brief clarification questions, if anybody wants to ask. I can see in the chat there are currently no questions, but maybe later on, we'll have some extra room again for questions. I actually wanted to ask a brief clarification question, because you talked about that Housing First clients now have like this Band A status, and that some, for example, homeless clients have a lesser band status. Yeah. And I was wondering how that works, how the bands are chosen, and also are we talking from when we talk about the bands, is it bands from A to F, or is it A to C, and somebody could be having like band C, or how does that work? If you could say a few more words about that.
Yeah, of course. So previously in the past, I think the Property Pool Plus system had about 6 or 7 bands. I think it went from A right down to F. And as part of the review, they decided to decrease that. So there's now just 4 bands. So it now goes A to D. Band A is the most urgent housing circumstances, so it will encompass homelessness, but it also encompasses things like domestic abuse, fleeing for life at risk, if somebody's had an extreme change in medical circumstances, things like that. Where there has been a bit of a mismatch is homeless cases who are not on Housing First, who may be in temporary accommodation, so it mainly affects hostel accommodation. A lot of those cases are still in Band B, and that's due to how they've been assessed and placed. And Property Pool Plus they have recently gone back out to consultation, and put it out to the public to see whether there can be a flex in that. And for homelessness cases outside of Housing First who would fall into Band B, the proposal is that they also receive Band A status. So that's one of the things as Liverpool City Region, we fed into it and we're like, yeah, we would support that wholeheartedly because we want everybody to receive the same sort of level of assessment of need. I guess it's in a positive way. I think it's an example of that Housing First was able to push for homelessness cases to receive Band A, but the negative side of it was that when the review came through, it just applied to Housing First, but now the property bill's been implemented for around 18 months. They can say, actually, we need to revisit this and go back out and think about it a bit differently. But unfortunately, it's just taken a bit of time.
Yeah, let's hope moving forward, also all the other homelessness cases can be moved into Band A. It would definitely be very important.
Yeah.
So there is actually a question now in the Q&A section. Mariella is asking, for how long are the rental agreements with the clients and how much are they charged as rent?
Okay, so because we mainly source through a social landlord, so social housing, they go on what's called a starter tenancy at first, which is a 12-month tenancy. And if there are no motions to end that tenancy during the 12-month period, it converts to what's called an assured tenancy, and there is no end date on that. It's just a rolling tenancy. That's one of the reasons why we primarily source accommodation through a housing partnership rather than with private landlords accommodation for our programme. When we have sourced through private accommodation, it's normally a 6-month tenancy, and then we can often be in the same boat then where 6 months in, we've managed to settle someone and then we're sourcing them something else. So we have had very, very few of our Housing First tenancies end within the first 12 months, if I'm honest, through evictions or things like that. So the starter tenancy, the housing association tenancy process works very well for us. If they end within the first 12 months of the tenancy, it's generally due to other reasons, like somebody needing to move or for a whole variety of reasons. So it works very well. In terms of what they charge, so it's social rents, so it's lower than whatever would be within the private sector. So I think in Liverpool at the moment, and I'm guessing here, but for a 1-bedroom flat, it's around £100 per week. So it really is well below standard sort of private market rent. So again, that works well for us also, because particularly where we've got service users who are claiming benefits, they should receive the full entitlement if they're going with a social landlord as well. So it works better. Whereas when it's been private, we don't have that. It can be too expensive.
Thank you for answering, the second question as well. So you can always continue sending your questions into the Q&A section of the webinar. We will be going to the next presentation now. And then in the end, there will be, as I mentioned before, a bigger Q&A section. So thank you very much again, Claire. And then I would hand over the floor to Ben to talk about the situation in Paris.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you, Claire, for that really interesting initial presentation. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Paris around our ACT service, which is called chez-soi d'abord. For those of you with good accents, you'll notice that I'm not French. So I'm from the UK, but I've been living here for over 10 years, and I work in Paris City Hall in the housing department. I'm a Housing First coordinator, which means I kind of coordinate it's more like a housing-led plan. So we've got about 15 measure action plan, which on a variety of areas around prevention, outreach, research, and also housing. And particularly both are housing construction, social housing buildings and new social homes, but also around housing allocations. And within that area, I work, and I've worked since I arrived 3 years ago with chez-soi d'abord. Paris, which is an assertive community treatment service. So I'm going to tell you today a little bit about that. I am, however, nowhere near as close to the details as the chez-soi d'abord team. We're fortunate enough to have Sultan, who's connected to the call, but as a participant. So if there are any detailed questions or requests for kind of examples, I can refer to him. So anyway, yeah, so I don't know, I'll just a little bit more background on me, and then I'll launch into the presentation. So I've been at Paris City Hall for 3 years. I was previously in another organization in Paris City region on access to housing for homeless people, and prior to that I spent 7 years doing training, consultancy and evaluation, particularly in the field of homelessness and particularly in the field of housing first and housing led, for an organization called ANSA. And as part of that, I was on the third cohort of the Train the Trainer program in 2019, the COVID cohort, and I've seen that actually Leah Watkins from Australia is connected to the webinar. I hope she's still here. Really nice to reconnect with her, and there was a really good group of people that some of whom I'm still in touch with from that cohort. So yeah, without further ado, I'll move across to my my presentation, and I will see if I can share. Give me a few secs. Sorry.
If you could take one of the questions, because then I have the slides ready now. So maybe if you answer one of the questions, and then we go to Ben's presentation, and then back to the questions at the end.
So I've got a question from, apologies because I don't know how to pronounce the name, Iona Vlad, I think that's what it says. So if you succeed in including in Banzai homeless households outside of Housing First, do you anticipate a problem with sourcing enough housing? Yes, I do. The thing with having a housing allocation register is that it sorts out the priority for who gets what. It doesn't actually address property supply. So that is something that needs to be thought about across Liverpool City region, and there are a number of things that we could do with that. But yes, I do think there will be a continued problem with sourcing accommodation, because we don't have enough of it, and we have a mismatch of supply in Liverpool City region. We don't have enough one beds, we just don't. We have an oversupply of 2-bedroom accommodation, which single individuals cannot apply for without contributing more rent. So yes, I do think there'd be a problem.
Thank you, Claire, for answering another question. And as I said, now the slides are ready. I'm going to share my screen, and then you can get started with your presentation, Ben.
So, yeah, apologies again. Thanks, Laura. So as I was saying, I'm going to start with a few words about the context. There's about chez-soi d'abord as a program, national program, and then tell you a bit more about the context also within Paris proper. So firstly, chez-soi d'abord. So it's, as I said earlier, it's an assertive community treatment program that targets chronic rough sleepers with severe mental health problems, primarily schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. From 2011 to 2016, there was a large-scale randomized control trial, so an RCT, that was run across 4 cities. So Paris was one of those 4, with Lille, Marseille, and Toulouse. And after 2 years of the pilot, there was a housing retention rate of 86%, and they calculated a return on investment that was positive. So I think it's just over €1,000 per year and per service user, because in particular they reduced hospitalization rates, acute hospital care, and other costs related to shelters. So it was decided in 2016 to scale up chez-soi d'abord nationally from those 4 pilot areas, which had around 100 users each, to 16 additional areas. And since they've increased that again to include more rural, semi-rural areas as well. And so it's important to point out that this chez-soi d'abord program is a key part of the Emmanuel Macron's housing and homelessness policy. And in fact, the results of the RCT kind of convinced him to put housing first at the heart of his national homelessness strategy. We've now had 2 housing first national strategies, within which this ACT service is absolutely key. So yeah. So it's important to understand what I'm talking about here is a national program within which Paris sits, and so the team in Paris works to the national framework around Housing First, around that ACT scheme. So there's a fidelity scale. There's a bunch of tools around identifying the target group, and the broad framework within which they're working is national. I'll tell you a few words now about kind of the Paris context. Thanks, Laura. So the team is a high fidelity ACT service, and it does they receive training and continuous training around Housing First from a Marseille-based training organization. And as I said, there's some very strict processes and criteria around target groups, and also in the way in which people access housing. There are 3 teams. There's a management team with the chief exec. There's a health and support services team. So they do have health practitioners within the team, including nurses, health peers, workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and GPs, so doctors. But they also, the core of the team is still social workers. And finally, there is a housing management team, which Pascal, who is here, leads up, and Sultan is part of, who work on securing tenancies, supporting tenants into their housing, rent collection, and maintenance and upkeep. So that's a team of 5 people. As in other areas, it was set up as a partnership of different organisations from the mental health, addiction and social fields. And in that partnership, there are amongst these 6 organisations, Paris City Hall, but also the psychiatric hospital called the GHU. However, over time, initially, all of those organisations pooled staff into this team, but today, the majority of the team are directly employed by the ACT service. Peer workers are also a part of the team today, and service user participation is really key. So they have these regular meetings of their service users to get feedback and to work on projects. So empowerment is a really key component in the service. And in terms of numbers, the team has a capacity of 155 service users. So their funding allows for 155 service users. Today there are 130, and we'll come back to this. But the main reason that we haven't yet got to that objective of 155 is housing. Housing supply is a really key issue for us. Just a quick word on Paris. So some of you will be able to find Paris on a map. It's the capital of France. It is unsurprisingly an area with very, very high pressure on the housing stock, very, very high private sector rents and sale values. The cost of land is incredibly high. And so all of that means that we have big challenges around access to housing broadly for the population in Paris, and particularly for the homelessness population. So the current administration and previous socialist mayoral candidates have made social housing a really key part of their mandate and their program. So we've got Paris has been a leading figure in the area of regulated rents. So we've got rent caps that have been introduced in Paris and then reintroduced. We've got a lot of work around regulating Airbnb. And a lot of work on producing new social homes, but also transparent allocations processes. I won't go into that in detail, but it's important to remind you that in addition to what I'm going to talk about today, there's a kind of direct route to housing for those who are homeless or poorly housed, which is called ARPP, and we rehouse about between 13 and 1,500 households a year through that process. And we also have a mainstream allocations process that prioritizes need using a scoring system. So social housing really key for the Paris City Hall. Just quickly on the context in social homes, I'm sure not all of you know about social homes in France. They are funded by public bodies. That includes Paris City Hall and the Housing Action, which is by taxes from businesses, who then have the right to allocate those homes. So if you imagine there's a building with 100 units within it, you could often will have 30 funded by the state, 30 by Paris City Hall, 30 by Housing Action, and then when that is delivered, we get basically informed of what units we get to allocate, each of us. So that adds a little layer of complexity to our housing system, as you can imagine, but it also means that Paris City Hall has direct access to these housing allocations. I've talked already about the multi-pronged housing system. Just quickly on pressure on the housing system, Laura, back. Yeah, the Paris is committed to achieving the 25% goal of 25% of social homes within the housing stock in Paris, and to achieve that, we've produced 110,000 units over the past 25 odd years. But today we have, whilst we have 260,000 social homes in Paris, we have 300,000 households waiting for a social home. So you can see that in the graph next to it, if you compare social homes and the actual social homes we to allocate, so only 10,000 a year, as you can see, there's a real issue around prioritizing need. So for every household that gets a social home every year, another 29 roughly are waiting. So it's within that context, you have to understand that within that context, every social home counts. And so it's really important. All the buy-in stuff we're going to talk about later on is absolutely key. Sorry, yeah, Laura, thank you. So now let's dig into a bit more detail around how social homes have been used for Housing First Paris, so chez-soi d'abord. Here's some key dates. So the Paris was named one of the 4 pilot areas for the RCT in 2011, and like their peers in the 3 other areas, they started by trying to secure tenancies in the private sector. And virtually, it's important to be aware that almost all of the other Housing First areas rely primarily on private sublets in the private sector. So they go and find private landlords who are willing to provide a unit. They then apply a sort of regulated rent to that property, and the landlord gets reduced taxes and other advantages, fiscal advantages. That means that they provide this private sector unit, and there's then sublet to the service user. That's the general model for chez-soi d'abord in France. However, those initial attempts to secure private sector tenancies were met with, let's say, mixed successes. The units that were provided were often of poor quality, not really adapted to the needs of people, the service users, and also had often very high rents. So very quickly the team, and also they just weren't in sufficient number. So the team quickly turned to us and the state to see if we could provide social homes. So in that first period, 2011 to 2017, Paris provided 20 social homes, and some were provided also by the state. And then from the scale-up period, 2017 onwards, there were then formal partnership agreements that were signed between Paris City Hall and 8 social landlords to provide 15 additional units. And then we had a third wave from 2022 to 2023, where new partnership agreements were signed with those same social landlords for an additional 40 units. And in parallel, the state signed similar agreements with 5 social landlords for 15 units. So just to sum up, over the past sort of just under 15 years, Paris City Hall has provided 75 odd social homes to chez-soi d'abord, and a number have also been provided by the state. And we're now at the end of that process we've fulfilled all the obligations in terms of providing social homes. So those 40 units from those recent agreements have all been provided. So we're at kind of a situation where we're kind of taking stock and reflecting on next steps. We can move on to the next slide, Laura. Thank you. So I'm just going to take you quickly through the actual process, detailed technical process. So the social landlord will see a unit that Paris City Hall is funded. They'll see that it fits within the criteria that we've set for the units, so they have to be accessible. It's primarily 1-bed units, and they send that information to my colleagues and say, we are going to send this housing offer to chez-soi d'abord, and we can sign off on that. And if we don't respond, it automatically our silence is seen as a validation of the offer. So then the description of the unit is sent across to chez-soi d'abord. And they visit, if it fits their basic criteria, they then visit it to check there aren't any issues that might arise, whether that be around the locality, whether that be around the accessibility, because some people do have health issues, and also the general state of the house, because sometimes some of the units can be in a poor state. Just to give you an idea, I think the average rent period for a social home in Paris is upwards of 15 years. So you can imagine when a property hasn't been renovated for 15 years, sometimes it often needs a real once over. If that after the visit they sign off on it, it then goes through the allocations process. So it has to be presented to the allocations committee of the social landlord, which they tend to meet weekly. And then at the end of that whole process, a tenancy agreement is assigned between the ACT service and the landlord. So it feels long, but actually Pascal and his team are really quick turnarounds. And I don't know, Pascal could probably tell us precisely how long it takes. I think it's something in the region of a month from start to finish, from the first email to the signature of the tenancy, give or take a week or two, but rarely much more. So that's how they secure the unit. And then once they've got the unit, it's theirs to allocate. And that, I think, that's a really key point, coming back to what Claire was saying earlier on. This enables them, who goes into the housing without any interference from the social landlord. Obviously, the person has to have a solid income and has to fit their criteria in terms of being chronic homeless and having a mental health problem. But other than that, there are no other additional criteria that would because often our housing allocations processes are parking a lot of housing first clients for administrative reasons. They don't have the right paperwork, basically. So here's the process for a service user who's identified through outreach services and our psychiatric hospital partner. So we've got a first meeting with the health and support team 10 days after they've been informed that they can now join the program. I should point out that they all apply to get into the program and are supported in that process from a social worker. So they get an initial presentation of the service, and they try to understand broadly what their hopes, their dreams, and their needs are. Then there's a first meeting with Pascal's housing team to get a better picture of what their future home looks like for them, and to understand their broader wishes. So that could be around the size of the property. It could be around the need to be able to accommodate a family member from time to time, a son, a daughter, a partner. It could be around the locality. And then there's a second meeting with the housing team shortly afterwards to try and ideally to visit 2 units. I think Pascal will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you don't have to visit 2 units if the first one suits you, but it's at least 2 units for all those who wish to have 2 units. But I don't know, Sultan can perhaps correct me there, but I think it's a kind of a minimum offer. But the good thing about that is that people have a right to refusal. So no one is ever excluded from the program for refusing a home. There are then discussions around rights and responsibilities, and if they accept one of the offers, they've got 5 to 7 days to reflect on that. Or if they're interested in an offer, they've got 5 to 7 days to reflect. And then there's a final third meeting with the housing team to sign the sublet agreement and to do the inventory. So to go through what the property looks like when they move in. And then from their move-in, they get support from their health and support team, including a dedicated budget to furnish the property, etc. So that's the kind of move into housing for a typical service user. I wanted to talk to you briefly about the partnerships around tenancies. So Pascal can confirm this. There have been some tenancies that have raised issues, whether that be with neighbours, caretakers, the allocations teams, some of the social landlords also have social workers that are formed about these. So when these issues arise, there's a question around how you get informed quickly of that there's an issue, and secondly, how you provide a quick response and that goes right down to the front line, and so that the caretakers typically feel like their concerns are being taken into account. And well, initially from 2011 to around 2021, Pascal and his team did one-to-one work with each of the individual social landlords, sometimes quite intensively, but a number of situations arose that sometimes were difficult to deal with. So I'll take a concrete example. One social landlord had around 6 units in an area in the south of Paris that were close together, several of which were in the area of one single caretaker, and there were a couple of issues, in particular with one tenant, and so the caretaker felt like he was overwhelmed by these issues, and there was some kind of relatively serious conflict between one tenant in particular and their neighbours, and so this led to Pascal to really try and tackle the issue with the social landlord by more regular meetings to mediate the conflicts and try and find a solution. And they were able to offer a new property to at least one, if not two, of those service users in another area of Paris, which suited their needs better and meant they were able to overcome those conflicts without having to go through any evictions processes. And I should add that within that area of when there are major conflicts or major crises for the users, they also have a couple of flats that are I forgot what you call these in English, but they're kind of they can be used for temporary accommodation. So they're normal social housing units, but that are available for crises or for moments where you need to mediate conflicts with neighbours, etc. So that reinforced partnership work with that social landlord was really the inspiration and for a new kind of way of working. So we decided that we really need to reinforce our partnership with them, both to keep an eye on the allocations, making sure there were enough allocations, but also to ensure there were no major issues arising in tenancies that weren't being addressed. So since 2022, we've had 6 monthly meetings with all social landlords and the Paris City Hall, and our partners from the state are also there. So everybody's around the table and with Pascal and his team. With the larger social landlords, there are quarterly meetings between Pascal's team and their team. So that means they can just take their temperature, make sure there are no major issues, and also provide information on sometimes there are some issues around the support services or issues that even Pascal's team weren't aware of. So it's really to have that open communication ongoing. And obviously regular contact when issues do arise between Pascal's team and the social landlords. So that kind of 3-pronged approach. Broadly, I should point out that now, Pascal will correct me, but there are no major tensions and no major issues that are not fully being addressed today, and I think that's improved a lot over the last 3 or so years. Pascal probably can't understand what I'm saying, but it's but something can translate if need to be. So now just on to key lessons and challenges. So firstly, some 3 key lessons from this experience. I should point out firstly, the whole point of all this is obviously to provide high quality, low rent social homes to our service users, and I feel from that point of view, the work we've been doing has been really successful. Obviously, we're still short of our target of 155 service users, but I feel that the work's really progressed in the last few years from that point of view, and they've had a couple of record years in terms of the number of new service users coming into the ACT service. I think there are almost 20 people in 2023 and 4. So that's the first point, that has been a success, I would say. And now on to more kind of key lessons. We've talked already about this, but political buy-in is absolutely key. So this very well-dressed gentleman is Yann Boissa, who is our lead, so political lead on housing, we'd call adjoint. and he's now a senator, but he for many years was a key support, provided key support for the ACT service. He was the one who was behind the 2 waves of partnership agreements, and it's really thanks to him primarily that we've been able to provide those 75 units. Now, there is political turnover. He has now been replaced by someone called Jacques Baudrier. He's very supportive as well. But you do need to continue to maintain those and continue to convince those political leaders, because they're always obviously the subject of other pressures on for what sort of what the social housing stock can be used for. So I think it's important, but also to maintain it. But it's not that's not sufficient. You also need to have a strong operational partnership with the social landlords. And here is Céline Museux, who's one of our key partners within one of the organisation I was talking about earlier on, who initially started with some quite difficult situation with those 6 units in the south of Paris, but Pascal and her worked very closely to resolve the issues around that, and now she's become a key advocate for Housing First within her organisation, and has spoken at our conferences, and unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she I would say is a real key advocate for the programme. So I think building those strong partnerships, sometimes you can turn a difficult situation actually into a real positive. And the third thing to say is especially for this mainstream service, you really need to shout about your successes. People will often generalize from a single crisis or difficult situation. That you still need to tackle those real problems as they arise, hence the duck metaphor, where you're working hard under the surface to resolve the issues, but on the surface you're moving forward and it's smooth and clear and clean. And I think that's absolutely key. Too often we don't talk about the successes of the people who are maintaining their tenancies, who've got good relationships with their neighbours, and actually the majority of the tenants of chez-soi d'abord are doing well. And now on to some key challenges, our current challenges. I talked at the beginning about the private sector properties. Now, the ACT service still has some of those private sector properties that are often very expensive, and they are the chez-soi d'abord has decided to return the majority of those properties. Around 4 a year are returned to the private sector landlord because they're just not appropriate. So we've got a bit of a leaky bucket issue where we're providing social homes, but then the private sector homes are being lost, which means we can't increase the number of service users as much as we'd liked. So that's a big challenge. The second is we're now dealing with not a exciting pilot project, but a mainstream service with mainstream funding, which is fantastic, obviously, for the sustainability of their funding. But sometimes it does create challenges around maintaining political and other buy-in, I would say, because it's seen as as something that's less innovative, and attracts less attention. So I think it's a real issue to maintain interest over time. And there's a final issue around moving from sublets to standard tenancies. At the moment, we only provide sublets through the Housing First service. There have been a few that have been turned into like mainstream tenancies, but very few, and it's not the current policy. So I think that's a big challenge for us. How do we move more of those service users across to standard tenancies? I should point out, the sublets do have an interest, do have a real value, and it means that people are paying low rents. That they are, I think Pascal would probably confirm, but very, very few of them have been evicted. If our eviction rates are incredibly low given the challenges of the service group, but for those people who sustain their tenancies over time, it is then have their own rent contract. That's it. Thank you very much. And I should probably wrap up by saying that most of what I said is in Unlocking Housing for Housing First, which you can find on the Housing First Europe Hub website. There are lots of really interesting examples from places like Finland, Berlin, so Scotland, Spain, around different approaches to producing and allocating housing first, or securing housing for Housing First services. Thank you very much, and I hope I didn't lose anyone by talking too fast.
Thank you very much, Ben, for another very interesting presentation. It was also very interesting to hear about these kind of real life cases of issues with tenancies that can arise and that it can happen, of course, that there are issues with the neighbors, for example, and that you've talked a bit about what a good strategy is to overcome them. And yeah, both you and Claire, you've really emphasized this importance of having strong partnerships with the landlords. And that's really like kind of the way to go and move forward. Before we
Absolutely.
kind of open the floor to more questions, and I see there are already some in the Q&A section, I just want to bring up 3 questions that actually already came in. When people signed up for the webinar, there was the option to share some questions. So before we go into the questions that the people who are present here have, I would like to bring those up as well. So they're addressed to basically both of you, Claire and Ben. So if you have some answers to the questions, feel free to answer them. So the first question is, what was hardest for you about getting the buy-in from those around you, and how did you work around this at the time and on an ongoing basis? So I guess it's about like the start of the 2 programs in your cities that you've talked about.
Claire, do you want to comment on that, on the buy-in issue? Oh, I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think for me, because I'd worked in social housing at the point when I joined the Housing First programme, and I remember actually when I applied for the job, understanding what housing associations would find difficult around making offers of accommodation to Housing First service users. So I felt that I was able to navigate, a lot of those conversations and sort of flip it, I guess, because I could see where there would be competing priorities, how Housing First managed tenancy sustainment is so different to how housing associations look at it and things like that. So I think in terms of achieving the buy-in and what was the hardest, I think it was the fact that lots of our service users on the service had already been excluded from social housing. So when we were having conversations with those landlords about adopting Housing First, they knew who a lot of our service users were and would be, and that's where a lot of the hesitations were around getting that buy-in. And I think it was just a very steady chip, and trying to convince them to just try it, and also to have honest conversations with them to say, housing and homelessness, you think that they're very, very similar, but actually they're very, very different. And do some of the processes in social housing actually solve homelessness? And they don't. They're working against each other. So actually, I think the big difference is that Housing First provides support, whereas lots of other homelessness individuals who were rooted through social housing, that support element is missing. So that I felt like was a bit of a golden nugget, that we could sort of cling to say, this is why these tenancies will be different, because you're not just leaving someone to just fly solo here. They get so much support. And also, I know Ben's mentioned it around that political commitment and stuff like that, but I can't underemphasize how much it made a difference to us having the manifesto commitment from the Metro Mayor in the Liverpool City region. I felt like that helped us get into so many rooms that we would not have otherwise been able to get into. And I think because we were one of 3 sort of mainstream pilots, and I think it's so interesting what Ben said. I've just written it down, Ben, word for word, where you said it's really hard to maintain momentum going from a pilot to a mainstream service, that shift. And I feel like because we were a pilot at first, it was like everybody was interested in it. It was something new, let's try this. Isn't this great? Let's all sign up. So we did have so much commitment and goodwill at the beginning. And we had chief executives who were like, yeah, let's roll the dice, let's give it a go, let's try something new. And in having their commitment, that helped us sort of try and win over frontline staff, because we could say, well, your executive is already threw the hat in the ring for this. They're already saying that you're going to give it a go. So you need to work with us, really. How can we work together? But as the program's progressed and we're now in our 6th year, it's different. So I think yeah, trying to get the hardest part about getting the buy-in was trying to I think from a housing frontline perspective, it was trying to get frontline officers to overcome some of their stereotypes of what homelessness cases and housing a homelessness cohort would be like based on previous experience that they'd had before. I think from a more strategic point of view, I think the hardest thing about getting the buy-in was that Housing First was just one program that was running. It was just one option for homelessness, but other agencies and stakeholders were saying, well, you know, Housing First is great, let's give it a go, but what about all these other things? What are you doing for them? So there was a real competing priority, a push-pull that had to be navigated, and we were always trying to say, let us try and pave the way a little bit with this program and see what can be done and come along on the journey. But whereas you've got other agencies who are crying out for interventions and support now, they were a bit like, well, your service doesn't help us. So when you were in those more strategic meetings, there was a bit of a push-pull there. I don't know whether I've answered it. It's just the things that are coming to me in my brain. They're the things that I thought were tough.
Thank you, Claire. And yes, I do think that you gave like super useful insights and that you answered the question. I don't know if you want to say something about that as well, Ben, or in your case, it's a little different, of course, with the pilot project and that it was a bit of a different starting point. But we can also, yeah, I don't know if you want to say.
Well, Claire, I feel like Claire's covered it really well in talking about that. It's not just the buy-in isn't just from one group, right? You have lots of different groups you have to target and think through how you work with those different groups. I completely agree with Claire on that, and they have different questions and different issues. So you're not going to be talking the same way if you're talking to your elected official versus your social landlord. Yeah, and I think so the thing and talking to the point around a manifesto commitment, it's interesting. We've never had a manifesto commitment as such. It's more like been buy-in. We've got as time went on, and kind of. But I think there is a real issue around how you get in the headspace of your elected officials and your mayors, and how you ensure that they're really bought into the program. And I think some of that's about figures, some of that's about the hard cold case for Housing First, but I think it's also about human stories and them meeting client users and understanding what that means for those individuals, where they've come from, and I think that helps. Some of those personal stories can really help them to rethink what this sort of program is and means. So, for instance, one of the typical things is saying, well, you know, why would we help them to jump the queue for social housing? It's a good example. Most of these people have been street homeless for over 8 years. So no one's in that context. They're not jumping any queues for the most part. So yeah, I think a lot of it comes back at the end to stories and using those. Obviously, it's something that you'd be instrumentalizing it a little bit, but on the other hand, I think it's absolutely essential. Yeah.
Thank you again to both of you to answering the question. The next question that we received in advance is actually very similar to one of the questions that I see here in the chat. In this case, it's actually addressed directly to Ben. But yeah, so it's about, I'll just read out the question in the chat. Where does the money come from to pay for the rent for the temporary flats for those in crisis with neighbors and so on?
So, chez-soi d'abord is fortunate as insofar as it's a well-funded program. So the rent is paid for by the team, and then the Pascal's team then collects the sublet rent from the service users. So if we've been allocated a good social home and the person has welfare benefits and housing benefits, there isn't really a differential between the rent that the ACT service is paying and the rents they're getting from the service users, and that's the objective. However, there are sometimes periods where the flat is unoccupied, or where the person's struggling to pay their rent for various reasons, and so in that period, basically the ACT service kind of sucks it up and has some money aside to cover that. that has created issues in the past, and they had some fairly substantial debt arrears, rent arrears, which weren't just from the tenants, but also from unoccupied properties, but was a big issue. They are addressing that, but broadly speaking, the model works because we've got rents that are around €500 a month. So these are small social rents. An individual will typically get 350 euros of housing benefit, and then they're all on welfare benefits, which are between 600 and 900 euros. So you can quickly see how they have enough to live. It's not a lot, but it's enough to live within those homes whilst covering the rent.
Thank you. I'll quickly go over to the last question that came in through the form prior to the webinar, and then we'll be focusing on the questions that I can see now in the Q&A section. So this is a question to the both of you, and it is, what should be the role of social impact investors regarding the issue of increasing the number of social housing units available for housing first and housing-led programs? And the same question also asks if there are any good practice examples in your country that you could share. I don't know if you have some insights on that, Claire, since Ben started answering the last question. I don't know if you want to say a few words on that, or if you have any insights to share.
Sorry, can you just repeat the first part of it for me, please, Laura? What would be the role of social impact? And then I missed the last bit.
So yeah, it's about what should be the role of social impact investors regarding the issue of increasing the number of social housing units available for housing first and housing-led programs.
Oh, it's a big question, isn't it? I feel like I can only base this on a Liverpool city region footprint, obviously, but I feel like what we need to do is have a look at the wider housing strategy that's written up for the Liverpool city region, and not just what we're building that's new. I feel like, if I'm honest, a lot of our housing strategy focuses on new build accommodation, and actually I feel like a lot of the solutions in housing supply also lie in making your existing stock work better for you. It can't just be about new build. It's got to be about what's already there, and how can you think a bit more innovatively to reconfigure it, repurpose it. So, for example, I mentioned earlier around we have an oversupply of 2-bedroom accommodation in Liverpool city region, and when the bedroom tax reform was brought in, it really decimated our housing supply, because we had single individuals in 2-bedroom properties who were forced to move because they could no longer afford them. So going back to the role of social impact investors, I feel like there is a role in that, in trying to work their input into our wider housing strategy around, actually, does our housing strategy actually meet the needs of the Liverpool city region and across various different groups? So I feel like also when we talk about homelessness, that encompasses such a broad group of cohorts, and I don't know that our housing strategy breaks it down to meet the needs of all the different cohorts that form part of that wider homelessness cohort. Domestic abuse victims, care leavers, maybe people who have had a relationship breakdown and they need to move on into something smaller. I feel like it's so broad, and when you're talking about, I think, social impact investors, I feel like there is a role for them in trying to unpick the mismatches in the housing strategies that are being developed and how they could be more impactful socially if they address the needs more of specific cohorts to repurpose the supply. I don't know whether I've quite answered that, 'cause I don't know whether I've fully understood the question, but I feel like our housing strategy needs just a little bit more thought. I'll probably get shot for saying that in where I work, but it definitely needs more thought, and there's definitely more role for social impact to be considered in that. I feel like Ben mentioned something earlier around we're so focused on numbers, And I feel like often when I look at a lot of housing strategies and stuff, it's just around, we will build this number of units by X, and that's sort of as far as it goes. But actually, who are those units going to be for? How are we going to assess who gets what? It needs more than just to focus on numbers. And I think that's where social impact and bringing in people with lived experience around what they need, what they want there's definitely something there, I think.
Thank you, Claire. I think it's a very important aspect that you also brought up, a very important approach to say it's not just about the numbers. You really have to also kind of put the work behind it into thinking which units are fitting for which client profile and so on. I would say we have time definitely for one more question, and there's one more question in the chat. And the question is, what do you do to be visible to housing partners? Do you provide paid training, for example? Maybe you can go first, Claire, and then we go to Ben.
Yeah, sorry, I feel like I'm taking all the questions here. So sorry, Ben. It's just interesting that you've mentioned about paid training, because this is something that we're looking at actually at the moment around trauma-informed care. So I think we've identified through our engagement with housing partners that there is a broader understanding of a trauma-informed process, and for that to be built in to housing allocation systems. And it's something that we feel like Housing First will be uniquely placed to sort of start conversations around that, because it's one of the main principles. And we've been discussing internally around a paid training offer for our housing partnership, and to invite in frontline staff to learn more around trauma-informed care, how you build it into systems, but also to mix them up with our Housing First team as well. So the idea is that we'll mix them up with our delivery team. And I think also in terms of ongoing training, that's just something that we offer with our housing partners regularly around what Housing First is as well, because I think housing associations churn so much. I've never known another sector to churn like housing. So you can lose your contacts very, very quickly, particularly around the front line. So there's always an ongoing offer there. And our delivery guide, which I mentioned, which we had a couple of years ago, we don't need to use that as much anymore because we're a firmly established programme. However, we have identified a need for an up-to-date frequently asked questions document, and that's something that we're working on at the moment to go out to circulate. So there's always an offer there, but I think where we've identified now a bespoke need, that's something that we feel like, well, if we're offering to fund that, we'll get more take up. So that's the plan.
Thank you, Claire. If you want to say a few words as well, Ben, if you have some insights to share on that as well.
Well, actually, we don't provide. I mean, the chez-soi doesn't provide training to social landlords at the moment. It's interesting you should raise that issue, because it's something we've talked about on a number of occasions. Because their staff, they've got lots and lots of staff, particularly caretakers, and there are some really major training needs, because there's a fair bit of turnover, but also they are people who very rarely have training in the social work or in the social field. So, however, I would say that we also have a prevention program that, in fact, there are several eviction prevention programs that work with social housing providers already, and that train them particularly on mental health issues. So it's not like there's no training offer at all, but I think that's an issue we need to look at, is do we need to add to that training offer? Because I think, as Claire was saying, it's an added incentive for the social landlord to continue to provide units and to work with you positively if you're helping them to address the broader issues of their workforce around mental health and trauma-informed care.
Thank you both so much for sharing your presentations, and also answering all the questions. We've already reached the end of the webinar actually. So yes, thank you for all the participants for joining. And you will get the recording of the webinar, as I mentioned already. And you can also find the report, for example, that Ben has been talking about on the Housing First Europe Hub webpage. And I actually wanted to mention that this is the first webinar in a series of webinars that focuses on housing and housing first, basically, and the sourcing of housing. And the next date is the 19th of June, again at the same time, 10:30 Central European Summertime. And we will be sharing more information also regarding the registration link and also the speakers soon on the Housing First Europe Hub webpage and also the Housing First social media, basically. So yeah, thank you again and have a great rest of Monday, basically.
Laura, just before we close down, I just wanted to mention that the Unlocking Housing for Housing First guide is going to be probably updated in the coming months, and so make yourself known if you have any good practice that you would like, or you think would be interesting to feature in that guide. And I don't know, Laura, maybe, and Samara, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can either put it in the chat if you've got time now, if make yourself be known, or send an email, I guess.
Yeah, so the email would be a better option because this chat doesn't seem to be working right now in this webinar session. But I think all of you should have my email address because I shared the link to this webinar with you. So we would be very happy to be receiving some new best practice examples for the update of the guide to make sure that a lot of people know about different ways, different innovative ways, different ideas on how to actually source housing for Housing First. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Laura, and thanks for everyone for connecting, particularly Leia for connecting from Australia. She's defying the time difference to be with us. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.